I will tell you what 40 years of silence sounds like. It is not quiet. It is a low, ceaseless grieving that fills every corridor of a stone hold, the sound of wolves that cannot rest, pacing the outer galleries in the dark, their claws a slow rhythm on the flagstones, their breath coming in the short, shallow pulls of creatures who have forgotten what it is to lie down and close their eyes. 40 years. I had grown so used to it that I no longer heard it as grief. I heard it as the sound of Velmore Hold itself, the way another man might hear wind off the Highland Pass and call it weather. The wolves had not slept since my mate died. I will say that plainly, because there is no other way to say it. Lyra was 23 years old when a fever took her in the dead of winter, 3 months after our bonding, before the wolves had even fully accepted her. They had been circling her, still uncertain, still learning her scent when she was gone. And something broke in them that night, some clockwork mechanism that connects a pack's animals to the piece of the hold they guard. They stopped lying down. They stopped eating properly. They paced, and they grieved, and 40 years passed, and still they paced. I stopped trying to fix it somewhere around the 10th year. Healers came. Herbwives came with sleeping tinctures pressed into raw meat. A woman from the southern marshes arrived with a drum and a chant and spent 3 days in the wolf gallery before the pack drove her out of the hold entirely. I brought in 3 women over the years whom my council called potential lunas, women of good bloodline and steady temperament, and the wolves would not be in the same room with them. They did not attack. They simply refused. They turned their backs, went still, and waited until the women left. One of them, a kind-faced girl from the Valley Lordships, told me very quietly on her last evening at Velmore that she was sorry, and she thought perhaps the hold was grieving for something she could not replace. She was not wrong. She was also not the one. After that, I told my council to stop sending candidates. I am not a man who wallows. I ruled. I managed the Highland territories, settled the disputes of pack lords who came to my gates, trained the young warriors who owed me service, kept the roads clear of the bandits that crept down from the passes in lean winters. Velmore held. The wolves paced. I slept in a room full of that soft, endless sound, and I called it my life. Then came the night of the eastern storm. It had been building for 3 days. A winter front that rolled down off the highest peaks with the particular fury that the Highland passes funnel into something twice as violent by the time it reaches the holds below. My steward Corvin had been watching the sky with the expression he used for things that were going to cost me, and by the afternoon of the 3rd day he came to me in the hall and said the pass road was likely to close before nightfall and anything or anyone on it should be brought inside. We sent riders out at dusk. They came back with 3 things: 2 goats that had wandered from a valley farm, a traveling tinsmith whose cart had lost a wheel, and a woman. She was on foot. She had a canvas pack on her back that was absolutely soaked through, a knife at her belt that was purely practical, and the particular expression of someone who is very cold and has decided to be dignified about it anyway. She was not young in the way of girls fresh to their first winter. She had the look of a woman who had been in weather before and survived it, but she was not old either. Somewhere in that middle ground where you stop being surprised by hardship and start simply responding to it. She told Corvin her name was Senna. She was a herb gatherer. She had been working the ridge trails above the valley for the last month, cataloging the winter-dormant roots that certain highland plants put down before the deep freeze, apparently useful to healers who could not afford to wait for the spring growth. She had not expected the storm to close the pass so quickly. She was sorry to impose. She asked very politely if she could sleep in the stable. Corvin, who is an old-fashioned man, told her no woman was sleeping in the stable while the hold had rooms, and brought her in. I watched all of this from the upper gallery. I had come to the railing because I heard the outer doors open, which they do not often do after dark in winter, and I looked down and saw her standing in the entrance hall with water dripping off her pack and her hair pushed back from her face, speaking quietly to my steward. She did not look around the hall with the wide eyes of someone unused to a great holding. She did not look around it with the calculating eyes of someone measuring its worth. She just looked at Corvan and answered his questions, and when he gestured toward the corridor that would take her to the guest rooms, she followed without ceremony. I stayed at the railing for a moment longer than I needed to. I do not know what I was watching for. There was nothing remarkable about a herb gatherer sheltering from a storm. My hold took in travelers during bad weather as a matter of course. It was the oldest of the Highland customs, and I had never broken it. The woman was wet and cold and grateful and unremarkable. I went back to my study and my maps and the border dispute I had been reading through before the writers came in, and I did not think about her again. That is what I told myself anyway. The truth is that something in my chest had gone quiet for a moment when I saw her. The way the noise of a windstorm sometimes drops for just a second between gusts, so sudden and complete that you hear your own heartbeat. I did not know what to make of that. I put it away in the place where I put things I did not know what to make of, and I went back to my maps. The storm peaked around midnight. I was still in my study. I do not sleep easily in winter, and the sound of the wolves was worse when the wind was high, as though the storm woke something in them that the ordinary night quiet almost managed to soothe, when I heard something that was not the wolves and was not the storm. It was a voice, very low, barely carrying over the wind, coming from somewhere in the depth of the hold in the direction of the wolf gallery, which was impossible because no guest had been put anywhere near the wolf gallery, and no sensible guest would wander toward it uninvited. The wolves were not vicious. They had never injured a human being in 40 years, but they were not welcoming either, and everyone in the hold knew to keep clear of their section of the keep. I put down my papers, and I went to find the source of the voice. She was in the long corridor that runs along the back of the wolf gallery, standing with her back against the stone wall and her pack set down beside her feet. She had clearly gotten turned around looking for something, the kitchens, probably, given the hour, and had walked into the corridor and found herself face to face with the first of the wolves, a large gray male named Bryn who had not let any person touch him in 30 years, and who was currently standing not 6 feet from her and staring at her with enormous still eyes. She had not run. She had not screamed. She had pressed her back against the wall the way you do when you want to make yourself very calm and very small, and she had started to sing. It was a lullaby, an old one. I recognized the shape of it without being able to place the words, the kind of song that has been passed down through so many hands that it belongs to no one in particular anymore. Her voice was not trained. It was not the voice of a woman who had spent years learning to perform. It was simply the voice she had, and it was steady, and it was true, and it was quiet, and it was doing something that 40 years of healers and herbwives and chanting marsh women had never managed to do. Bryn sat down. Not backed away, not turned aside. He sat down, the way a dog sits when it has decided that the thing in front of it is safe. His haunches dropped to the flagstones and his ears went from forward to easy, and his enormous eyes went from watchful to something I could only call uncertain, as though he was not sure what was happening in his own chest and was waiting to find out. I stayed in the shadow of the corridor entrance, and I did not make a sound. She sang another verse. I could see her hands pressed flat against the wall behind her, bracing herself, but her voice did not shake. She was watching Bryn the way you watch a large animal you are not sure of, with attention and respect, and without sudden movement. After the second verse, Bryn lowered his head. His chin nearly touched the floor. His eyes drifted half-closed. The second wolf came out of the gallery. Her name was Myra. She had been Lyra's favorite in those 3 months when Lyra was alive, and she had paced harder than any of them in the 40 years since. She came to the edge of the corridor and stopped, and I watched her nose work the air, and I watched her look at the woman against the wall, and I watched something in her shift. She did not sit down, not yet. She stepped forward. 1 step, then 2. Then she sat. The woman's voice broke very slightly on a syllable and then steadied. She kept singing. I cannot tell you exactly what I felt in that moment. I have tried to find words for it many times in the years since, and the closest I have come is this. It was like standing in a room that has been sealed shut for 40 years and feeling the first current of outside air come through a crack you did not know existed. Not warmth yet, just the possibility of air. Something in my chest, that old clockwork place that stopped the night Lyra died, made a single small movement. Like a wheel that has been still so long it has forgotten it was meant to turn, and then turns and is surprised by itself. I pressed my back to the stone and I breathed and I watched. By the time the third verse ended, there were 7 wolves in the corridor, all of them seated, 2 of them with their chins on the floor. She had stopped pressing herself against the wall. She was still standing, still very careful, but her hands had come forward from the stone, and her posture had changed from cornered to something closer to awed. She looked at the wolves around her with the expression of someone who cannot quite believe what they are seeing, and kept singing, because stopping seemed like the wrong choice. I do not know how long she sang. Time does not work properly in certain moments. It is one of the things I learned in the first year of grief and never unlearned. I know that by the time the corridor was fully quiet, there were 11 wolves lying down, not pacing, not watchful. Lying down, the way they had not lain down in 40 years, and some of them were making a low sound in their chests that in a house cat you would call purring and in a wolf you would call something rarer and more solemn. She stopped singing very slowly, the way you ease a sleeping child down from your arms, careful, gradual, not breaking the contact before you have to. The last note died, and the corridor was silent except for the storm outside and the sound of wolves breathing deeply, slowly, in the rhythm of creatures who have finally found rest. She stood there for a long moment with her hands at her sides and the wolves lying around her, and then she covered her face with both hands, and I could see from across the corridor that she was shaking, not from fear, from the overwhelming shock of something extraordinary happening to an ordinary person in an ordinary night. I stepped out of the shadow. She heard me before she saw me. Her hands came down from her face and she turned. And when she saw me standing at the entrance of the corridor in my dark traveling clothes with no crown and no ceremony about me whatsoever, she straightened. She did not know who I was. Of course she did not. She had been delivered to a guest room by a steward and had gone to bed. And this was a man standing in a dark corridor at midnight, and she had no reason to give him more authority than that. I am sorry, she said, very quietly, mindful of the wolves. I was looking for the kitchens. I got turned around. I did not know they would, she gestured at the wolves at a loss. I was only trying not to startle them. You did not startle them, I said. She looked at me more carefully. Something in my face or my voice or the way I was looking at her, not with the ordinary curiosity of a man who has stumbled on something strange, but with something older and more careful, seemed to register. She said more slowly, Is this all right? Have I done something wrong? You have done something, I said, that no one has done in 40 years. She looked at the wolves again. Myra was asleep. Bryn's great chest was rising and falling in the deep rhythm of genuine rest. Senna looked at them the way a person looks at a thing they cannot explain, and then she looked back at me. I only sang, she said. It is just an old song. I do not even know where I learned it. Go back to your room, I told her gently. Sleep. Do not worry about the wolves. I will have someone show you to the kitchens in the morning. She searched my face for a moment longer, and then she nodded, picked up her pack from where she had set it down, and went quietly back the way she had come. She did not ask who I was. She did not ask what any of it meant. She simply went, with the unhurried trust of a person who has learned that some questions answer themselves when you are patient enough to wait. I stayed in the corridor for a long time after she was gone. 11 wolves sleeping. The sound of the storm outside, The first quiet that Hold had known in 40 years, not silence but rest, which is a different and far more valuable thing. I put my hand on Bryn's side, something I had not done in decades, and felt the rise and fall of deep sleep under my palm. He did not stir. I went to my study, and I did not pick up the border papers. I opened instead the locked cabinet behind my chair, the one that holds the personal records of the Velmore bloodline, the journals of my father and his father before him, the letters that were too private for the Hold's main archives, the sealed volume of my grandmother's observations that I had read once, the night she gave it to me, and never opened since. My grandmother Reva had been a scholar of the old Pack lineages. She had spent 60 years compiling records of bloodlines that the modern world had largely forgotten, the old gifts, the old connections, the ways that certain human families had walked alongside wolf packs for so long that something of the pack had settled into their blood. I opened the journal to the section she had marked with a red cord. I had not thought of it in years, but something in the corridor, something in the way the wolves had responded, the speed of it, the totality of it, the way Bryn had sat down in the middle of the first verse, had pulled at the edge of a memory. The entry was dated 43 years ago. My grandmother had written in her careful, close hand, "The Packsinger line is not extinct, as the lowland scholars assert. I have found evidence of 3 living branches, all of them dispersed, all of them unaware of what they carry. The gift presents as simply this: a voice that settles pack animals at the marrow level below the reach of training or will. The wolves do not merely calm, they sleep." And in a wolf pack bonded to a bloodline, the settling of the wolves is the oldest sign of a true mate. The old records call it the lullaby seal. When a woman of Packsinger blood sings to a grieving pack and the pack lies down, the bond between her and the pack's alpha king is already done. It was done before she arrived. The singing is only the confirmation. I sat for a long time, with the journal open in my lap. Outside my study window, the storm was finally beginning to ease. The pass would be open by morning. The wolf gallery was quiet, and somewhere in the guest corridor of my hold, a woman who had been looking for the kitchens was sleeping without any idea of what had just happened. I am not a man who makes impulsive decisions. 40 years of ruling a Highland territory will cure a man of impulsiveness fairly thoroughly. I turned the matter over in the way I turn every difficult matter, methodically, from all angles, looking for the flaw or the error. I told myself it could have been coincidence. I told myself the wolves might have been simply exhausted enough to finally sleep, and the singing happened to coincide with the exhaustion. I told myself that my grandmother's research, thorough as it was the work of a woman who had spent 60 years looking for patterns, and that people who look for patterns long enough begin to find them everywhere. But Bryn had sat down in the middle of the first verse. Bryn, who had not let a human hand touch him in 30 years. Who had stood at the threshold of the wolf gallery like a sentinel for 4 decades, and watched every healer and herbwife and would-be Luna walk in and walk back out again. Bryn, who had been Lyra's almost wolf, the one she had been slowly winning over in those 3 months, who had been closest to lying down for her when she died, had sat down in the corridor within 60 seconds of hearing this woman's voice, with the ease of a creature who had recognized something so fundamental that there was nothing left to resist. I closed the journal, I put it back in the cabinet, I locked the cabinet. And then I sat in my study with my hands on the desk, and looked at the wall and understood, in the way that a man understands things he has been avoiding understanding, that my life had just changed. The question was what I was going to do about it. The answer that my grandmother's journal supplied was not one I could act on in the middle of the night, while the woman in question was asleep, and unaware that she had just fulfilled a 40-year-old prophecy in the back corridor of a hold she had only stumbled into because of a storm. Whatever the bond was, whatever the lullaby seal meant for the connection between her and the pack and me, it was not something I would proceed with unilaterally. She had not come here looking for an alpha king. She had come here looking for the kitchens. In the morning, I thought, I would find out who she was, where she had come from, whether any of this, when daylight came and the wolves were awake again, held. I went to bed. The wolves were still asleep when dawn came. I know because I went to the gallery before anyone else in the hold was awake, before the kitchen fires were lit and the morning watch had finished their rounds. I walked through the connecting corridor and into the gallery and found them exactly as I had left them, or rather, as they had arranged themselves around the hour past midnight. 11 of them in the corridor, the rest in the gallery proper, also lying down. Every single wolf in Velmore Hold was asleep. I stood in the doorway for a long time. Then I went to the great hall and I told Corvan, when he arrived for his morning duties, that I wanted to speak with our guest before she went anywhere. Not to delay her against her will if she wished to leave. The storm had passed and she was free to do so. But I wanted to speak with her, and I wanted him to tell her so, and I wanted him to tell her that there was no urgency about it. She should eat first. He gave me the look he has been giving me for 30 years, the look that means he is filing away this moment for future reference, and he said yes, of course, and he went. She came to me in the small morning room off the hall, the one I use for conversations I do not want to have in public. She was clean and her pack was over her shoulder, ready to travel, but she had accepted the breakfast Corvan mentioned because she was a sensible woman, and a hot meal is a hot meal. She sat across the table from me without ceremony and looked at me with the same direct, unhurried attention she had used the night before. In the daylight, I could see her more clearly. She was, as I had noted the night before, in that middle ground of age that has nothing to do with youth but everything to do with being present in the world. Her hands, folded on the table, were the hands of someone who spent a great deal of time outdoors, marked by work, careful. Her face had been in weather. Her eyes, which were a very ordinary brown, had the quality of water over stones, clear and patient, and not particularly easy to read. I spoke your name last night, I said, and I realize now that I did not give you mine. I am Aldrich. I am the lord of this hold. Something moved briefly in those patient eyes, recognition, and then a rearrangement of last night's conversation, and then a steadiness. I see, she said. I apologize for the informality. You were not informed, I said, and you had other concerns at the time. I am not troubled by it. She looked at me for a moment. The wolves, she said, are they? Asleep, I said, still all of them. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that is not normal. No, I said, it is not. They have not slept in 40 years. That landed. I watched it land. She did not exclaim or perform surprise. She simply absorbed it, turned it over and said, 40 years. Since when? Since my mate died. She was quiet again. She was, I noticed, very good at being quiet, not the quiet of someone who has nothing to say, but the quiet of someone who has learned to give things space before speaking about them. Finally she said, I am sorry. It was 40 years ago, I said. It was the answer I always gave, and it was true, and it did not cover what I had come to understand about the previous night. I leaned forward. I set my grandmother's journal on the table between us, open to the marked entry. I would like to show you something, I said. You do not have to read it if you do not wish to, but I think you should. She looked at the journal, she looked at me, she read. I watched her face as she read my grandmother's careful, close-written text. She read slowly, as a person reads something they are reading for comprehension rather than speed. When she reached the passage about the Paxinger line, something shifted. She went very still in the way that people do when they recognize themselves in a description they were not expecting to find. When she reached the part about the lullaby seal, she set the journal down very gently and folded her hands on top of it and looked at the table for a long moment. Then she said, I do not know my bloodline. I know, I said. My mother was a herb gatherer, her mother before her. I have traveled since I was 17. I do not have," she stopped. "I do not have a hold or a family record or any of the things this would require for proof." "The wolves are asleep," I said quietly. 40 wolves, every wolf in Velmore Hold. In 40 years no one has managed that. Not a healer, not a herbwife, not a trained Luna candidate. You walked into a corridor looking for the kitchens and sang a song you do not know the origin of, and they lay down. She said nothing. "The journal calls it the lullaby seal," I said. "My grandmother called it the oldest sign of a true mate. I am not telling you what it means for you. I am not asking anything of you. I want you to understand what I know, and I want you to be free to do with that knowledge whatever you choose." She looked up at me then. "What do you choose?" she asked. I had prepared for many versions of this conversation. I had not, I realized, prepared for her to ask that question so directly, so early. I found that I was glad she had. There is something about a woman who goes straight to the point that clarifies a man's own thinking considerably. "I choose to ask if you will stay," I said. "A few days, long enough to speak. Long enough for you to see the hold and the pack properly, and for me to learn something of who you are, and for you to determine whether any part of what my grandmother wrote makes sense to you. I am not asking you to commit to anything. I am asking you to stay for a few days." She looked at me for a long time. "I have a list of routes to catalog," she said at last. "The ridge above the valley. It will wait a week before the freeze sets in too deep." "Then you will stay." "I will stay a few days," she said, "and we will speak and we will see." It was not a yes. It was the most honest answer available, and I took it. The hold discovered, over those days, what I had discovered in the corridor. It was not something I announced. It was not something I needed to announce. The wolves made the announcement for me. When Senna walked through the gallery the first morning after the storm, they rose, not the sharp alert rise of animals ready to defend, but the slow, smooth rise of animals greeting someone familiar. They moved to her. Bryn, who had not let a human touch him in 30 years, put his broad head under her hand. She stood very still, letting them, and I watched from the gallery entrance with my hands at my sides and something very quiet happening in my chest. By the second day, the hold staff had all found reasons to be somewhere with a view of the gallery when she walked through. By the third day, Corvin had stopped pretending he did not know exactly what was happening and had started having hot tea ready for her in the morning without being asked. My council, who came for their regular weekly meeting on the fourth day, arrived to find the chief wolf-keeper Aldrin, a taciturn man who had managed the pack for 30 years with deep devotion and very little hope, sitting in the gallery entrance looking, for the first time in memory, not like a man tending a grief, but like a man watching something recover. She spent her mornings in the gallery or on the southern walls where she could see the ridge she needed to visit. She spent her afternoons in conversation with me, in the morning room or walking the inner courtyard when the weather allowed, talking about everything. Her work, the plants she had catalogued, the routes she had walked over the last decade, the old remedies she had collected from elderly herbwives in passes, so remote they still remembered cures that the lowland healers had forgotten. She talked about her childhood, which had been nomadic and not unkind. She talked about loneliness without self-pity, as a fact of her life that she had arranged around rather than resented. She asked questions about the hold, about the territories, about the pack lords and their disputes, and the winter road and the old Highland customs that I was one of the last people preserving. She was interested in things. Not performing interest, actually interested. The way people are when they find the world genuinely worth paying attention to. On the second evening, she asked about Lyra. Most people did not ask about Lyra. They had learned over 40 years that the subject was not one I offered and not one I welcomed. She asked directly and without apology, the way she had asked me what I chose on the first morning, and I found myself answering in the same way, directly, without the performance of distance that I had cultivated for 4 decades. I told her about the 3 months. I told her about the fever. I told her about the morning I understood it was not going to break, and the morning after that when I walked into the Wolf Gallery and found them already changed, already grieving, before I had told anyone, because they had known before I did. I told her that the grief, after 40 years, was not a wound anymore but a scar, permanent, tender in certain weathers, but not the kind of thing that stopped you walking. I told her that what I had lost was not just Lyra, but the belief that the bond was still available to me, that the clockwork place in my chest had any more movement left in it. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "And now?" "And now," I said carefully, "I am not certain the clockwork is as stopped as I thought." She looked at the fire. "I have not had a mate," she said. "I have been in weather and I have been lonely, and I have had the pack instinct all my life without understanding what it was, the way animals trust me, the way I always knew when something was wrong with a bird or a horse before it showed it. I thought it was just a gift for quietness. I did not know it had a name." "It has a name," I said, "and it has a place." She looked at me. "You are going slowly," she said, deliberately. "You deserve the time," I said. "You have not been promised anything, and I will not pretend that what happens in this hold happens everywhere. You have your work and your roots and your life as you have built it. I have no right to ask you to set it aside before you understand what you would be setting it aside for." She was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. Outside, the night was clear for the first time since the storm, and the stars over the Highland Pass were the sharp, close stars of deep winter, the kind that look like they are only just above the battlements. "I understand more than you think," she said at last. She did not say more than that. She did not need to. The third evening, Myra came to the corridor outside the morning room while we were talking. She did not come in. She sat at the threshold and waited. Senna noticed her first and went still, and then she rose from her chair and went to the threshold and sat on the floor beside the wolf, the way you sit beside someone who is waiting to be near you, and she put her hand on Myra's side, and Myra put her gray head in her lap and closed her eyes. I sat across the room and watched and understood, in the way I had been understanding things slowly since the night of the storm, that the 40 years of silence were over. Not because Senna had arrived with an announcement or a proof or a bloodline document, but because Myra, who had paced the hardest and grieved the longest and kept the most faithful watch of any creature in Velmore Hold, had decided that the watch was done. On the morning of the 5th day, I asked her to walk with me to the great hall. She came without asking why, that patience of hers, that willingness to let things unfold at their own pace. The hall was not empty. I had sent word to my council and to the senior members of the Hold staff and to the Wolf Keeper, and they had come, as they always came when the Lord of Velmore summoned them. They stood around the edges of the hall, unhurried, waiting. The wolves were in the hall. All 40 of them, not in the gallery, not in the corridors, in the hall itself, which they had not entered since Lyra's last morning in the Hold. They were arranged without any instruction from me, simply there, the way they had arranged themselves in the corridor on the night of the storm, quiet and watchful and at rest. I took Senna to the center of the hall. She looked at the wolves, she looked at the people along the walls, she looked at me. Her face was very still and very attentive, and there was a trace of something in her eyes that was not quite fear and not quite wonder but somewhere between, the expression of someone who is watching the shape of their own life change and is not yet sure whether to reach for it or step back. "I told you," I said, "that I was not asking you to commit to anything." "You did," she said. "I find that I need to revise that statement," I said, "not in the direction of asking for more, in the direction of being honest about what I want to ask for." She waited. I reached into the breast of my coat and took out the thing I had retrieved from the locked cabinet that morning, my grandmother Reva's own mate seal, the piece of old silver she had worn on the day of her bonding, the one she had left to me with a note that said I would know when it was time. A small thing, plain, worn smooth from decades on a woman's wrist, with the mark of Velmore on the clasp. Not a great ceremonial object, a true one. The lullaby seal is a recognition, I said, not a command. You are not bound by the wolf's sleep or my grandmother's journal or anything else. I am a man who has lived for 40 years in a grief he did not know had an end in it, and I am looking at a woman who walked into my hold in a storm and settled it, and I would like, if you will let me, to be the man who asks properly, before my hold and my pack, whether she will stay. She looked at the seal in my hand. She looked at the wolves around us, Bryn and Myra, and the others lying easy on the stone floor of the great hall with the early winter light coming through the high windows. She looked at the people along the walls, my council and my steward and old Aldrin the wolf keeper, who was openly weeping and doing nothing to conceal it. She looked at me. You said you were going slowly, she said. I said that, I said. This is not slow. No, I admitted. It is not. Something moved in her face, that expression that was halfway between wonder and fear, and then it settled into something else, something I had no word for in that moment. Something like a decision reached after a long journey. She reached out and took the seal from my hand and turned it over in her fingers and looked at the mark of Velmore on the clasp. I have a list of routes still to catalog, she said. We can wait for the thaw, I said immediately. And I have a way I have lived, she said. That is not the way of a hold. I am not trained for ceremony. I do not know the customs. The customs can be learned, I said, or set aside. I'm not marrying a ceremony. She looked up at me. What are you marrying? A herb gatherer, I said, who settled 40 wolves with an old song she didn't know the origin of and sat on the floor with my most grieving wolf, and asked me directly what I chose, and answered the same question honestly. That is what I am asking to marry, if she will have me. She looked at the seal for a long moment. Then she turned it over once more, and she closed her hand around it, and she held it the way you hold something you have decided to keep. Bryn rose from the floor not quickly, not with alarm, and came to stand beside her. He was large enough that his shoulder was level with her hip. He pressed against her side with the calm certainty of an animal who has made up his mind, and she put her hand on his back without looking down, the way you touch something you have already accepted. Yes, she said, I will have you. The hall was quiet in the way of things that have finally resolved. Not the silence of something stopped, but the silence of something settled. My counsel stood straighter. Corvin, who I had never in 30 years seen publicly emotional, blinked 4 times in quick succession and looked at the ceiling. Old Aldrin sat down on the bench behind him because his knees had apparently given out, which was understandable under the circumstances. I took the seal from her hand and placed it on her wrist at the clasp, and when I looked up from fastening it, she was watching my face with the patient, attentive look she had used since the first morning, the look that saw things. I do not need the ceremony, she said quietly. Nor do I said, but I needed the hold to see. She understood that. She understood most things as I was learning by the time they needed to be understood. Around us the wolves lay at peace. Not a single one paced. 40 wolves in the great hall of Velmore Hold in the deep winter light, breathing in the slow rhythm of genuine rest, their long grief finally done. Myra was asleep against the base of the far wall, her gray side rising and falling, her paws tucked close. Bryn stood beside Senna with his broad head up and his eyes easy. There are things you spend 40 years learning to live without, and there are things that return to you in a storm, in a corridor, in the voice of a woman looking for the kitchens in the middle of the night, and when they return, you understand that the waiting was not emptiness. It was simply the hold, keeping faith, until she could find her way in. She spent 3 more days cataloging the routes on the ridge above the valley before the freeze set in. I went with her on the second day, carrying the canvas bag while she worked, learning the names of things that had been growing in the highland soil for centuries without my ever having thought to ask what they were called. She taught without making me feel ignorant, which is a particular skill not everyone possesses. She talked about the ridge and the plants the way she talked about everything, as though the world was worth paying attention to, and paying attention to it was its own reward. We came back down to the hold at dusk, and the wolves met us at the lower gate, and they walked back with us, all 40 of them, unhurried, at ease, moving through the evening snow with the purposeful peace of creatures who knew where they were going and were content with it. She looked at them and she looked at me. "They have been waiting," she said, "for a very long time." "Yes," I said. "So have you." "Yes," I said. "I have." She slipped her hand into mine, which was warmer than the Highland air and more certain than 40 years of silence, and we went through the gate and into the hold together. Bryn walked at her left shoulder. Myra walked at her right. The rest of the pack followed, padding through the torchlit courtyard in the comfortable silence of animals who have come home. I know what grief sounds like. I also know now what it sounds like when grief ends, not with a proclamation or a ceremony or a moment of perfect clarity, but with a woman who was looking for the kitchens, and a song she did not know she was fated to sing, and 40 wolves who had kept faithful watch for 40 years, and finally found the thing they were waiting for. Velmore Hold is not a silent place anymore. It is a quiet one, which is, as I have come to know, an entirely different thing and far more worth the keeping.